Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Leo, and also acknowledge Alan Platt, who's been very helpful in instigating this work and planning this particular event. The senator in the first session mentioned a number of times the words transformational. And that is indeed one of the goals, that we want a recovery, but we want a recovery that actually transforms the economy into a stronger, more sustainable economy that is more healthy for the American middle class. And one of the underlying assumptions of the transformational economy is that we must move from a pattern of economic growth that was too focused on debt-financed consumption over the past 10 to 15 years, and that is relates to creating jobs in real investment in our economic future, and that in the short term at least, short to near term, that investment will probably have to be led by public investment. And we have, I think, three of the most interesting voices on that particular issue with us today. As Steve mentioned, we have the Honorable Bruce Braley, is a Democrat from Iowa, the chairman of the House Populist Caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives, and we'll be seeing the president today, I understand. Next to him is Michael Lynn, my longtime colleague, the policy director of the Economic Growth Program, and the author of many of the important policy papers coming out of our program this year. And finally, Robert Kuttner, who has been the long co-editor of the American Prospect, one of the leading progressive voices in this country over the last decade and a half. And the magazine, Bob's perhaps a little bit more long-standing than the magazine, and the author of yet another book that Steve Clemens mentioned with the title Presidency in Peril, the Inside Story of Obama's Promise, Wall Street's Power, and the Struggle to Control Our Economic Future. We'll begin with Congressman Braley because he will have to leave for the White House shortly, followed by Bob Kuttner and Mike Lind. Congressman.
Thank you very much. It's my distinct privilege to be here today, especially on this panel. Michael, your book, The Radical Center, The Future of American Politics, accurately describes the 1st District of Iowa. 40% of my district is registered as independents, 28% are registered as Republicans, and 32% are registered as Democrats. So I don't get to do this job unless I reach the radical center. And Robert, I've been a huge fan of yours, read a lot of your work, and the American Prospect was immensely helpful to me in my first campaign, especially on messaging at a very difficult time in our country's history. I want to talk just briefly about why I decided to refound the Populist Caucus and why I was so pleased that Senator Dorgan was here. The Populist Caucus was originally founded by my good friend and Iowa colleague Tom Harkin at the height of the farm crisis in the 1980s. And that was founded by some people you might recognize, people like Senator Dorgan, who was in the House at the time, Al Gore, Tom Daschle, Bill Richardson, people whose districts were being devastated by the economic policies of this country. And one of the things that drew them together was how those policies were impacting their districts back home, many of whom depended largely on agriculture as a huge means of their economy, as well as states like Iowa, which also have a heavy manufacturing base. It's significant that I moved to Waterloo, Iowa in 1983 at the height of that farm depression. And to give you some sense of how devastating that is to my community, when I first arrived in Waterloo, there was a blue-collar manufacturing base at John Deere, which had 5 manufacturing facilities in Black Hawk County where I live, that employed about 16,000 workers. Today, there are 2,000 UAW workers in Waterloo and Cedar Falls, and all of those plants are still running. And one of the reasons I decided to reform the Populist Caucus was because my impression is that there were a lot of ideological caucuses here within the larger Democratic House caucus, but there was not a central focus on the core economic issues that were dramatically impacting the middle class and those who aspired to enter the middle class. The reason that was so significant to me is both of my parents grew up on Iowa farms during the Depression, and that experience shaped everything about their lives and the life that I had growing up in a small town, Brooklyn, Iowa. I got my first job when I was in 3rd grade, and I've been working ever since. And just about any kind of job you can imagine, I've done it. I delivered newspapers. I sold Christmas cards door to door. I mowed yards. I shoveled walks. I baled hay. I shelled corn. I worked as a janitor. I drove dump trucks. I worked heavy construction. I worked for a county road department building bridges. I tended bar. I worked as an ad runner for a newspaper, and on and on and on. And one of the things I can tell you about those experiences, it gave me a very deep appreciation for the people who make this country work every day. And they're the people whose voices have been lost during this recession. And so what we did is we brought together diverse members from across the Democratic House caucus. And I'm very proud of the fact that the Populist Caucus has Blue Dogs, New Dems, Progressives, members of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and we bring a laser-like focus on these economic issues, and we've decided to focus on a set of core values that relate to quality education, quality jobs, a sensible trading philosophy, and health care that makes sense, and on and on. But one of the things we tried to do in responding to this recession was come up with a Populist Caucus blueprint for recovery based upon these 3 main principles of compensation, speculation, and job creation. So I want to just share with you briefly what our blueprint for recovery does. It begins with ending excessive Wall Street compensation by providing inducements that would discourage companies that received large government bailouts from turning that money into excessive bonus compensation. So my good friend and Populist Caucus member Peter Welch from Vermont introduced the Wall Street Bonus Tax Act. And it said that if you received bonus compensation and you were a recipient of federal TARP money and your bonus was in excess of $50,000, anything in excess of $50,000 will be taxed at a 50% rate. And that money will go into a direct lending program within the Small Business Administration to finally start creating jobs, improving access to credit, and that bill is estimated to generate $3.2 billion of revenue annually for that express purpose. And then another thing to deal with the excessive speculation that drove us into this recession is Peter DeFazio's Let Wall Street Pay for Main Street tax provision that Senator Harkin is also supporting. And it's a very simple idea, and that's simply reinstating a very small transfer fee on excessive stock trading that was in place for nearly 60 years in the United States and is used in many of our competitor nations. And use that money to develop about $150 billion in annual revenues, half of which would be directed toward a job creation trust fund, half of which would be used to reduce the deficit. And it doesn't affect middle-class families because it specifically exempts retirement accounts, health savings account, education savings accounts, and the first $100,000 of transactions. So the whole focus is on those manipulative, excessive trades that don't provide value to people in the middle class. Job creation. One of the things that we know is that a jobless recovery isn't a recovery for middle-class Americans and people struggling to enter the middle class. And that's why we have a 2-pronged strategy to deal with that. One is Keith Ellison's National Infrastructure Database. We know that there are a lot of private investors who have been raising money to invest in infrastructure, and the vast majority of that infrastructure investment has taken place overseas. But they have raised about $100 billion that could be used for dedicated projects in environmental energy, telecommunications, and other areas to leverage private funds for the public good. And Senator Dorgan is the perfect example of why this is so important to my state, especially in energy development. We have 6 manufacturers now building components for wind turbines in the state of Iowa. We rank number 2 in the country behind Texas in wind energy production. But a lot of people are surprised that North Dakota has the most wind energy potential of any state, and yet they don't even appear in the top 20 rankings because our grid does not have the capacity to take that wind energy we could be producing in North Dakota and get it to the east and west coast where the demand is greatest. But if you look at a manufacturing policy that could benefit this country immensely, it would be one built upon a renewable energy philosophy that harnesses the power of the wind and other natural resources and uses that to create jobs, putting people to work to create the grid that we need. The last piece of our blueprint for recovery is Congressman Dan Lipinski's Buy American Improvement Act, which is something that Senator Dorgan mentioned, which simply eliminates loopholes in our existing domestic sourcing laws and requires the federal government to look internally when it is trying to place orders for goods and services. We also have an American Jobs First strategy, and I'm just going to touch briefly on the 4 pieces of that platform. One is the Trade Accountability Reform, Development, and Employment Act, the TRADE Act that my friend Mike Michaud, who's the chair of the Trade Working Group in the House, has introduced. The second is the End the Trade Deficit Act. The third is the National Manufacturing Strategy Act, which Senator Dorgan talked about. And the fourth, and one that's frequently overlooked, is the Foreign Manufacturers Legal Accountability Act. And this has come up repeatedly during the Toyota hearings. If you are a consumer who is injured by a defective foreign product, it is literally impossible, especially if it's made in the country of China, to hold the manufacturer accountable. And the irony is most state laws exempt the retailers of those products from legal liability if the manufacturer can be served and is not in bankruptcy. So you have this anomaly of this deep black hole where these goods are being manufactured in China, and some U.S. distributors mistakenly represent those products as being made in the USA because they may be assembled in part at a distribution facility here, and yet when those defective products injure a U.S. consumer, it is virtually impossible, first, to find the actual manufacturer, second, to serve them under the treaties that we have with China, and third, to eventually hold them accountable so that the U.S. taxpayers don't have to pick up that tab if that person is permanently disabled and goes on Social Security disability. So Congresswoman Sutton's bill would require every foreign manufacturer to have a registered agent in the country for the purpose of service and streamline the cumbersome, convoluted process of accountability. There's a lot of other things that I'm working on and my colleagues in the Populist Caucus, but I want to make sure that these other distinguished panelists have time because they actually have studied these issues and have a lot of great insights that we can all learn from. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman Braley. We'll now hear from Bob Kuttner.
Thank you, and thanks to New America Foundation for convening this. Well, where is the recovery going to come from? Where is the next economy going to come from? We know that the economy of the past 2 decades has been a bubble economy. It looked in the 1990s as if it was a real period of prosperity, but in retrospect, this was the first stage of a bubble, financed by corporate debt, financed by individuals using debt as a substitute for wages. So we can't go back to that economy. And we also know that despite the fact that GDP growth has turned positive, there is a terrible downdraft of low wages, weak manufacturing, escalating foreclosures, the state fiscal shortfall, which over the 4-year period since 2009 to through 2012 offsets about 80% of the federal stimulus, so it's almost neutral in terms of the stimulus to GDP. Commercial real estate, and an LBO bust, private equity bust, that is going to be as large as the subprime bust, because the same kind of techniques of securitization that were used in subprime were used to fund private equity takeovers that pillaged operating companies and syndicated the debt. And when those companies go bust, as they are doing increasingly in a recession, and also because their assets were stripped by the private equity people, that's going to be a debt meltdown as large as the subprime meltdown. Now, it feels very much like the recovery of the 1930s, where GDP growth turned positive, but unemployment stayed above 13%. And of course, we had this amazing deus ex machina that came along called World War II, where unemployment in the course of a year drops from 13.8% to about 2.5%. And all the rules on deficits are waived. The deficit in 1942 was 29% of one year's GDP. And, people like my parents invested in war bonds. And World War II, apart from being a military victory, had all of these beneficial side effects. It recapitalized a generation of American industry. It reemployed a generation of American workers. And it produced the greatest Keynesian stimulus of all time. So that even though half of the things we built during World War II were blown up, real living standards increased during the war years by about 12% a year. And then the post-war recovery was built on the pent-up demand, consumer demand, and the built-up technological progress that the war had generated. So my hypothesis is very simple. We have to come up with a non-belligerent equivalent of the kind of positive economic shock that World War II produced. And of course, during the war, there was no trade. The idea that you have to have trade to have economic recovery is nonsense. During the post-war boom, trade relative to GDP was about 5% of GDP right through the 1960s. So how do you make this thinkable? Because all of the things that we need to do are so far beyond the periphery of mainstream debate, it's kind of frightening. I often say this is a time when to be a liberal you need to be a radical, because the kinds of things that Congressman Dorgan and Leo Hendry were talking about are just not central to mainstream debate. Well, you either need much more presidential leadership than you're getting, or you need much more pressure on this president, or you need Congress to lead, or you need all three things. Because otherwise, the Obama presidency is going to be a failure. He's not going to deliver the kind of recovery that the country needs and that is going to allow him to be reelected in 2012, or that is going to prevent a blowout in the midterm elections this coming November. The administration's own statistics project an unemployment rate of 7.2% in 2013. There is an $11 million job deficit, even using the Bureau of Labor statistics that don't take into account all of the people who are underemployed, that puts the real number closer to 18 or 19%. That means that we need to be producing 500,000 jobs a month for the next several years to get back to the unemployment level of 2006, when the economy really wasn't doing that much for ordinary Americans. So in 4 minutes, how do we achieve this? Well, everyone else has spoken here about the need for a serious industrial policy, not a token industrial policy. I subscribe to that. I mean, if you look at the stimulus package, there's a lot of nice stuff in it. There's a lot of good things that progressives have had on their wish list for a long time, but they're not at a serious scale. Secondly, even if you got manufacturing employment from current levels of around 9% back up to 15%, which is not even remotely on the horizon, but let's say that was possible, you still have to wonder, what are the other 85% of the people going to do? There was a celebrated paper by the Nobel laureate Wassily Leontief that he published in 1974 and he was so disgusted with the economics profession that he published it in Science magazine. And Leontiev asked the question, what happens when the economy is so productive that machines produce almost all of the physical goods that we need, and there is one worker employed in manufacturing, and her job is to flip the switch? What does everybody else do for a living, and how do you allocate the fruits of all of that productivity? And that, in a sense, is the question that we face, even if you assume a manufacturing renaissance that we still have to fight to achieve. And I think the answer is that if you look to the successful countries of Northern Europe, they have all kinds of policies beyond their industrial policies to make sure that there are no bad jobs in the economy. For instance, you could have a national policy that every human service job is a professional job, that everybody who works in a preschool gets paid at least as much as a kindergarten teacher, that everybody who works taking care of elderly people gets at least as much money as a licensed practical nurse. And you could go through the entire human service sector and create tens of millions of good jobs. But you need a manufacturing sector producing real stuff to piggyback on top of before you can have the kind of active labor market policies that would both provide the training but also provide the wage guarantees and the national commitment that there shall be no bad jobs. That entails a stronger labor movement. It entails government using tools of public policy that have gotten rusty. I was very pleased that the administration, and we did a special issue of the American Prospect last fall, calling for this, that the administration is going to use the federal power to contract, as Presidents Kennedy and Johnson did before the civil rights laws were enacted by Congress, to insist that anybody who has a contract with the U.S. government or who is bidding for a procurement contract with the U.S. government has to be a high-road employer. No misclassification of permanent employees as contract workers or temps. No really crummy low-end jobs. And the only problem is that they have proposed this, but again, as is sadly typical of what much of this administration's done, they haven't proposed it at a serious enough level. And here I'm echoing Steve's opening comments. It's not just a matter of talking the talk. You have to do it at a level of seriousness and at a scale that is really going to make a difference. So it seems to me a serious industrial policy, World War II without the war, a trade policy that demands that countries that benefit from their membership in the trading system and from their access to our markets not cheat on the trading system the way China's entire industrial system does. An active labor market policy that's not just built upon education as a panacea. I think that's far too facile to assume that if everybody gets a 4-year degree or if more students graduate from high school ready for college, that by itself will be sufficient. It isn't. And we had a middle-class, blue-collar economy in the 1940s and 50s and 60s when a majority of people who worked in factories hadn't even graduated from high school, but they earned enough money to support a middle-class lifestyle. So education, yes, but education's not a silver bullet. And above all, I think we have to think much bigger as a society than we're thinking, because all of this incremental stuff is not going to get us where we need to get. It takes a crisis to create the opportunity to think big, but a crisis is not a guarantee that we will think big enough. And final point, it is not that the trade policy is incompetent. Trade policy is very, very competent. The problem is that trade policy is dictated by the financial industry. If you read the memoirs of Robert Rubin against the memoirs of Joe Stiglitz, you realize that the entire strategy vis-a-vis the WTO, vis-a-vis China, TRIPS and TROPS and all of the WTO acronyms that gave primacy to finance were done very deliberately to make the world a bigger playing field for U.S. multinationals and for the U.S. financial industry, but at the expense of manufacturing and at the expense of the well-being of the economy. So this is going to take revolutionary policy changes, not piecemeal ones. It requires us to think big, to think politically, and to radically transform the way we comprehend all of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Congressman Braley, I know you have to leave very shortly. I think you have to leave in a minute or two. But you're obligated to come back and field 3 or 4 questions at another occasion, and also to listen to Michael Lind, because you need to hear both Bob Kuttner and Michael Lind together, because this is a progressive populist blueprint. So.
We'll send you the YouTube.
No, I don't want to break the rhythm of the panel and be fair to Mike.
Well, let me say I won't be offended if anyone else leaves for a meeting with the White House. So feel free. I'm honored to be here with Congressman Braley, who's fighting the good fight on Capitol Hill, and as well with Bob Kuttner, who's been fighting the good fight in the intellectual arena for many decades. I want to focus in my remarks on the intellectual paradigms that are shaping the debate, because a lot of the time, people tend to assume, critics of what is happening tend to assume it's a matter of corruption. It's just lobbies. It's just special interests. But I think there are certain paradigms, certain intellectual systems which dominate public policy for 30, 40 years at a time. And then there's a break because they no longer are accurate maps to reality. When this country flourished between the New Deal and the Reagan administration, the paradigm was the mixed economy. And that it didn't just mean you have socialism and social insurance, Social Security, Medicare, and then everything else at the free market. It actually meant that markets, first of all, there is no such thing as the market. There are particular markets in particular sectors that are created by government for public purposes. And the assumption was that the representatives of the sovereign people decide on a case-by-case basis, if you have this public objective, do you pursue it through direct governmental means, through an agency? Do you create public-private hybrid government corporations to pursue it? Do you have a regulated, privately owned monopoly that's a utility? Or do you create a market with lots of competitive firms? That was the first question. The default assumption now is that in every single sector of the economy, there is an imaginary perfect market. And you have to justify deviations from the market instead of simply saying the market is one of 4 or 5 different tools. That's the norm. That's the system of natural liberty, as Adam Smith called it in the 18th century. And any deviation from this natural, universal, cosmic system has to be justified. Thus, the theory of market failure, which ironically was created by liberals in the 50s and 60s to justify more government intervention, but it has now become something that it tyrannizes our mentality, because everyone from left to right thinks that, well, government can't do anything unless the market has already failed doing so. And so you have to come up with an elaborate justification of why the government is allowed to do anything in the public interest in the first place instead of the market. And then when you add to this the neoliberal emphasis on subsidies and incentives to private for-profit corporations to carry out public purposes, this shows you how far we have drifted from the original New Deal liberal, Johnson liberal approach to market failure, because they would have, that led to a dead end intellectually, but at least they said when there was a market failure, a government agency can do something or a regulated utility can do something. By the time you get to Clinton and Obama, it means if you first you have a market failure, and then you reject 90% of the tools for addressing the market failure, and you limit yourself basically to 2. I was in the room with a senior White House economic advisor who said, and I won't name names, this was off the record, but said, and I quote, we, meaning the Obama administration, We do not believe in regulation. We believe in incentives and transparency. It's an astonishing statement. That would have made no sense to most American policymakers between 1900 and the 1970s and 1980s. Then on top of that, you have this idea of subsidies. That is, we can't even have private regulated utilities anymore. For example, if you look at our healthcare system, every other country in the world that has multiple private insurers and multiple players, you don't have to have single payer. They have a system called all-payer regulation. It's essentially price controls. It's fee setting. This is what we have in public utilities, right? This is off the table. Forget single payer. Simply having the government negotiate fee schedules every year and say, an appendectomy costs this much, and drugs cost this much, which is the way that Switzerland, which has a private healthcare system, does it. This is so Bolshevik, it can't even be considered. So the neoliberal, that's the term for what succeeded New Deal liberalism, and it includes Reagan conservatives and New Democrats. This neoliberal economic paradigm basically says that government can't do anything unless there's a market failure, and then it has to subsidize for-profit corporations to do what obviously they can't make a profit at doing, because otherwise they wouldn't do it. And so you get an ever-growing amount of things that are done either by the government, other countries, or by regulated private utilities, being done by rent-seeking for-profit enterprises, which are sucking down subsidies from the taxpayer, which are bribes. Now, I'm in favor of private enterprise. This is not private enterprise. It's not private enterprise if the taxpayer is subsidizing a company to make a profit to do something that no private enterprise would do, because there's no profit in it. So that's the mentality that we have to address. The second thing I want to address is false alternatives, and I want to build here on what Leo Hendry said earlier and Bob Kuttner. There are a lot of very good ideas for affecting the economy in the long run, indispensable ideas that are not going to create jobs in the next few years or even the next few decades. And here I'm just going to be contrarian. Innovation. Innovation is crucial to our long-term economic future. It takes a long time to go from the laboratory to deployment to employment. The internal combustion engine was invented in the 1860s. Cars did not become a mass consumer good until the 1920s and 1930s in the United States, and it took until the 50s and 60s in Germany and Japan. Most historians say that when there's a new disruptive technology, there is a time lag of 25 to 50 years between the invention and the time it starts to revolutionize the economy. Remember, transistors developed in the 40s and 50s, and the IT revolution really brings up productivity in the 1990s. So by all means, we should shower research on nanotech and biotech and all of that. But that's something for a generation or two to see the real transformation of the economy. Small business. I want to endorse what Leo Hendry said. Where the U.S. is losing out in global rivalries is in tradable goods industries with increasing returns to scale. Well, increasing returns to scale means that it's easier for a big company to add a little more production than it is for somebody to start a completely new company. That's why we don't have mom and pop airlines. Aerospace manufacturers, And so the other problem with subsidizing small business at the expense of big business is you create a political constituency that is against regulations for workers on the grounds that it will drive them out of business. Now, here's a radical thought. Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s defended fair labor laws by saying that companies that cannot meet these labor standards should not exist in America. So that's something to think about when it comes to some small and medium enterprises. Maybe their workers would be better off working for big and established enterprises. I could go on. Education. The Bureau of Labor Statistics says about 30% of jobs in the next generation will require a 4-year BA, right? So if you send 100% of people to get 4-year BAs, then all that does is it becomes the new GED or high school diploma. It doesn't increase productivity. The Obama administration, to its credit, has expressed interest in Congress as well in community colleges and in training. I think we should look there. I've got about 5 minutes left. I'm just going to wrap up with this vision that's already been touched on of the economy of the future. Well, we kind of know what it is if you're looking at a long-term historical scale. Because of productivity growth, we see as one sector becomes more productive and does more with fewer people, labor is then shifted to a sector where there's less opportunity to substitute machinery for labor. So first, agriculture becomes incredibly productive in this country. It sheds labor, which is absorbed by manufacturing. Manufacturing has been shedding labor for some time. And it sheds it to initially to the tertiary sector, which is business services. So in other words, it's inputs, it's service sector inputs, insurance and accounting and so on, to General Motors, to Boeing. And that still accounts for about 40 to 50% of the service sector in both North America and in Europe. We say that 80% of people work in the service sector, but about half of that is actually inputs into the primary production sector, manufacturing, and that's why it's absolutely correct that even if farming only employs one person and manufacturing only employs one person, all of these service sector jobs those generate, which increase over time, are absolutely crucial. So you have to have advanced farming, advanced mining, advanced manufacturing as the anchor. The quaternary sector is the final end-use service sector. These are jobs, whether they're well-paid like personal financial analysts or poorly paid like maids and nannies, where it's not part of the inputs into the productive sector. But nevertheless, this is going to be an increasing part of the economy. And there the answer in a couple of minutes. The slogan, I think, should be service sector Fordism. Now, Fordism in the manufacturing sector meant the manufacturing workers could afford to buy the manufactured products that they built. Well, here's an idea which is so completely radical, it's unthinkable at the moment. But we're trying to be the think tank of the future. Service sector workers should make enough money to employ service sector workers doing the same thing they do. All right? The maid should be able to hire a maid. The nanny should be able to hire a nanny. The gardener should be able to hire a gardener. These service sector jobs should be performed by middle-class workers for each other. They should not be performed by a proletariat of serfs for a small number of rich people. So on that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. And the congressman was good enough to stay for at least one question.
Huffington Post. The jobs bill that you're going to go celebrate shortly in the Rose Garden with the president, serious or unserious?
Well, it's a step in a direction of trying to address a problem with chronic unemployment. So it's a serious step in trying to